and I am an immigration judge in Chicago, and I am on a detained docket, and I've been an immigration judge since 2016. Now we have close to over 400 people today who are currently on the town hall. Over 1,000 have registered, and I think more people are joining every minute. People from across the immigration world, including judges and EOIR staff, DHS, OCC trial attorneys, ALA and the private bar, pro bono attorneys, immigration media, academics, and just interested private citizens. Everyone is welcome. Thank you for coming. Now, this meeting is not in any way sponsored by the U.S. Department of Justice or by the Executive Office for Immigration Review. Instead, it is being put on by the NAIJ, the National Association of Immigration Judges. And all the views expressed by the judges who are participating do not represent the official position of the United States Department of Justice, the Attorney General, or the Executive Office for Immigration Review. The views represent the judges' personal opinions, which were formed after extensive consultation with the membership of the National Association of Immigration Judges. I want to start out by telling you a little about how the town hall is going to proceed tonight. NAIJ President Judge Ashley Tabador is going to be the first speaker, and she's going to give a presentation of about 20 minutes or so about the state of the immigration courts during the pandemic and NAIJ's activities on the health and safety front. After Judge Tabador's presentation, we're going to be joined by several key representatives from the pool of stakeholders for questions and comments. And the third and final portion of the meeting will be dedicated to answering as many of the questions as we can that we've received that have not been touched on by the speakers. You also have a chance to meet the remaining members of NAIJ's board. Now, I'd like you to feel free to submit questions by directing them to the panelists through the Zoom chat interface. And before we start with Judge Tabador, I want to make sure that everyone is aware that this meeting is being recorded and it will be available to replay on NAIJ's website. I also know there are members of the media who are in attendance. Welcome to them as well. Now, I'd like to introduce Judge Tabador. Judge Tabador is the president of NAIJ and has been an immigration judge since 2005. She currently presides over a juvenile docket in Los Angeles at the Van Nuys Immigration Court. Judge Tabador.
Thank you, Judge Cole. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the National Association of Immigration Judges, I'll welcome you to the first National NAIJ Stakeholder meeting. We hope that you and your loved ones are healthy and safe during these challenging times. For those of you who may not know who we are or are familiar with us, we are the official representative union of all immigration judges. What this means is that we are not the Department of Justice, as Judge Coleman indicated, and we're not here in the capacity of EOIR. We speak in our capacity as union representatives of the immigration judges across the nation. And similar to many of you, we are frustrated, anxious, confused about EOIR's actions in response to the pandemic. That is why we felt it was important to have this meeting and convene as a community at this time, due to the profound impact that the pandemic has had and continues to have, not just on the operations of the court, but on the lives of everyone involved. We plan to utilize this time together to accomplish 4 goals. First is to open the line of communication. So we will share with you what we know about the operations of the court. Second, we will share with you what steps we have taken as NAIJ in trying to protect the health and safety of judges, and by extension, those of you who appear before us or work with us in the court. Third, we want to hear from you about your concerns and your challenges. And fourth, we would like to explore ways that we can all work together towards minimizing the inherent risks of convening court hearings in the age of the pandemic. Now, as Judge Cole mentioned, we have received tremendous response from everyone, along with a comparable number of questions. For obvious reasons, we will not be able to address every question, but we have grouped them into similar categories and plan to spend time answering them answering the most common questions asked. What I can say about the questions, though, is that in large part, they fall into 3 categories: the operation of the court, the plans for reopening, and any agency protocols to minimize the risk of the health and safety of all involved. So I will begin with those areas. As we go through these topics, though, please bear in mind again that the judges and the NAIJ are not the agency decision makers. And as the saying goes, don't shoot the messenger. So I have 7 bullet points that I'm going to delve into. The first has to do with the current state of the court. With the current state of the court, we can divide it into the detained court and the non-detained court, or the detained docket and the non-detained docket. The detained docket has been ongoing throughout the pandemic, regardless of the stakeholders' call at the beginning to slow everything down, suspend it, and allow us to take a breath and implement protocols that would consider the health and safety of everyone. So we really have to extend a big thank you to the judges, support staff, and the public who've had to come in during those most dangerous times at the beginning of the pandemic and have to learn and be the trial and error through this time. So we want to say big thanks to those who've had to go through that, and those dockets continue to be operated. Not effectively, not efficiently, but the push has been to continue to operate them. Second, the non-detained dockets. Well, as many of you know, since March, the non-detained docket was suspended. Initially, it was the master calendars. Later, all non-detained hearings were suspended. But you saw that the courts were all quote unquote open. What this means is that for those courts that have the non-detained dockets, they have a skeletal crew of support staff who've been forced to come into those buildings in order to be present at the reception windows, as well as provide some level of support in terms of filings and motions that we're receiving. Everyone else has been sent home who's been dealing with the non-detained hearings. So judges have in large part with teleworking. That is, the judges for whom the agency has had laptops. It was surprising to find out that there isn't enough laptops for all the judges, much less all the judges and support staff. So judges who have been assigned to non-detained dockets in large part have been given laptops and are working on motions and filings and decisions. And the support staff, to the extent that they've been sort of compelled to go into the courts, have been providing support and providing the ROPs. So that might explain why there's been delay in receiving the decisions or the processing of documents. It's because of this disconnect. But at this point, there has been a big push to reopen the non-detained dockets and resume those court hearings. As you know, there's about a dozen courts that have been announced to have been in phase 1 or additional phases of reopening or resumption of the non-detained docket. Where did this come from? Well, the phase reopening was announced through the White House in April through a generic White House national reopening plan. The national reopening plan contemplates 4 steps. The first step being a gated phase, which is where everyone was in April when the policy was announced. Then it was to be followed with 3 reopening phases, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. The plan calls for the progression from one phase to the next based on specific data about the number of infections in the particular relevant locality, the number of available spaces to address the health and hospital needs of those that are anticipated to be infected, as well as other considerations as to quarantine or stay-at-home orders. What we have seen with the immigration court is that the agency is not the one making the decision, apparently, about which courts are opening well. The department or high-level officials have decided that the relevant person to make the decision is the U.S. Attorney's Office or the specific U.S. Attorney for the district in which the immigration court sits. The U.S. Attorney's Office are presumably expected to consult or be guided by the White House reopening plans. But other than that, we have not been given any sort of information in spite of repeated attempts and repeated requests to be provided the specific data upon which the U.S. Attorney's offices or the U.S. Attorney himself or herself is relying on in making the decision about when we hit each phase in each district. There's been a lot of questions about what level of information as to the local conditions are to be considered by the court. Other than from which we know, other than what the U.S. Attorney's Office is considering with respect to the working conditions of their offices and the district courts, we're not sure what, if anything, they're considering about the immigration court. What we do know, however, is that in some of the areas in which the courts have been deemed to be in phase 1, for example, a lot of the local conditions have not been considered. So people have been called in to come in for hearings and then forced into violating local quarantine orders. So people from other jurisdictions are being called for hearings where the jurisdiction of the court may have quarantine orders against those other interstate travel. So we have not had any explanation as to how that is to be addressed or considered on a grand basis. So we've been constantly having to deal with this lack of transparency, but this is all the information we've been able to get as to the question of how are these decisions made. We do know that apparently the decisions are being made on a weekly basis. So apparently on Mondays or perhaps on a Sunday, there would be some announcement about which courts are going to be in phase 1 or phase 2 and which courts are going to remain in the suspended phases. We were initially told that there would be 2 weeks minimum of 2 weeks between phase 1 and phase 2. However, that information turned out to be not accurate because shortly thereafter, we saw that Buffalo went from one phase to the next within a week. Now, what does it even mean to be phase 1, phase 2, or reopening of the court? We have had very great difficulty in trying to gain an understanding of what sort of reopening plans the agency has in mind for the court. Apparently, there are significant reopening plans that have been generated for each court. We have asked for those reopening plans, and the agency's position has been that they will not provide it to NAIJ prior to the actual announcement of reopening. So clearly, no input, no collaboration is on the mind of the agency or open to it by the agency. To the extent we've been able to review any of the reopening plans, they do address some physical localities. They talk about social distancing and wearing of masks, but there's very little about other not more important, but equally important issues regarding access to the buildings, elevators, waiting areas, and as well, the management of the court docket. One of the major issues we've heard from the questions was, well, we don't know what hearings are going forward with these court reopening plans. I would say we don't know either. The other issue has been the constant lack of communication, transparency, or accountability regarding what happens when you reopen courts and people with COVID symptoms come into the court and or later find out that they have tested positive. So much of what you see is what we're experiencing as well. I can tell you prior to pandemic, anytime any court across the country ran into any sort of minuscule problem that affected the operations of the court, a nationwide email was sent to everyone so that we would know what's happening to our colleagues in other courts. That was a good, transparent, and effective communication. However, with the pandemic, there has been no such communication. The only way we really find out if there's been any impact of the pandemic on a court is similar to perhaps what some of you are getting through Twitter feeds and through some sort of a listserv email that has a one line, certain court will be closed today. And oftentimes we have to ask others through a secondary layer of information or secondary layer of network what happened. So there is no transparency as to what protocol is being used when someone is coming into courtrooms with COVID symptoms or is tested positive. A lot of times we're told that, well, those who need to know will be contacted, those who have been in close contact will be contacted. And anytime we ask for additional information, the agency has cited to HIPAA as a reason for why they are not sharing information with us. However, we're not asking for anyone's name or identity. What we're asking for is to let us know and let everyone know when there has been a reported incident of COVID, someone coming into the court space, whether the courtrooms or in the office space, and where they have been. That way individuals can figure out, was I in that location? Did I possibly have exposure to that? How many of us do remember how many people we may have run into that day or several days before if we find out that we have been tested positive? So we have no reliance or any sort of faith that whatever protocol, if any, that the agency is following regarding the health and safety of everyone as to these incident reports is defensible. Fourth, I want to talk about NAIJ's response to the pandemic and the agency action. We believe it is very important, it's critical for everyone to make decisions based on evidence-based scientific approach. And so we have reached out to amazing experts, and this is a good time to just pause and say thank you to Dr. Jha, Director of Harvard Global Institute, and thank you to Dr. Milton, Professor and Board Certified Internal and Occupational Environmental Medicine with the University of Maryland. They have been instrumental in educating us as we go through this pandemic to help us develop the instrumental guiding principles to help us look to practical solutions as the agency forges on for reopening of the courts. So based on our evidence, scientific approach and consultation with experts, some of you may recall that our initial response was to coordinate a united call for suspension of all hearings. That was in March, in order to allow for us as a nation and for the healthcare workers to be able to flatten the curve and make sure that everyone has access to healthcare. Since then, we've also made several demands to bargain with the agency. The agency has made tremendous changes to the working conditions of all involved. And under a labor law, it is instrumental and required that the agency engage with the union in order to work out and bargain over the impact and implementation of those agency decisions. So when you decide to send a mass number of your judges onto telework, but not onto others, that requires you to bargain. And the agency has flat out refused. When you're dealing with significant health consideration and protocols that need to be followed, you need to be engaging with your union, and the agency has denied and has failed to do that. But we've continued to make the demand to bargain. We have filed grievances based on that, and we plan on and are committed to following through with all our legal remedies available to us. In addition, we have filed a national health and safety grievance based on the agency's failure to engage with NAIJ and to follow the necessary protocols, CDC protocols, and other expert-based protocols for protection of the health and safety of everyone. And again, similar to those, all those grievances have been denied, but we will continue to stay focused and follow all our legal remedies. We do have a health and safety joint committee that the agency most recently agreed to attend. Under our collective bargaining agreement, there is a requirement for the agency to seek our input and to provide us information regarding any health and safety considerations or policy changes they are to make. So far, the agency has failed to provide us the necessary information or to seek our input. But we are trying, and we're going to the meetings, and we're trying to persuade the agency to work collaboratively. Fifth, what are the guiding principles that we learned from our experts in trying to guide us through this process? So they fall into basically four major considerations, or I should say 5 major considerations. The first is you need to identify and exclude symptomatic people and protect vulnerable populations. So what this means is we need to have policies and procedures that address people who are attempting to seek access to the building, such as touchless temperature taking, such as screening questions, and procedures to be able to notify us when people don't have access or are denied access. In addition to, of course, ensuring that everyone is wearing a mask. So that is the second big part. Ensure that everyone is wearing their mask and wearing it properly at all times while in public. Third, we need to ensure practical social distancing and low density gatherings. So this means we need to have protocols and uniform approaches to how to handle elevator situations, waiting room situations, the need for proper signage, and the need for making sure that the capacity for each location is not surpassed. We haven't been able to gain those kinds of working conditions or collaborations with the agency. Oftentimes the answer is that this is outside of their purview, that this is something within the Federal Protective Service or the GSA or the commercial building in which the court is situated. But that, from our perspective, does not relieve them of the responsibility to ensure everyone's health and safety and work together to come up with acceptable protocols. Next, we need to make sure everyone follows proper hygiene and hand washing. I think this is one that everyone is aware of. And the last on guiding principles is the issue of secure, proper ventilation of space. That is an important part that we have reached out to the agency over and over again to let us know what sort of steps they're taking to ensure that the ventilation in these spaces, as you know, most of the courts, if not all, are in sealed buildings. So no one can really open the window and allow fresh air, because fresh air is one of the greatest ways to combat the infection. But so far, we haven't been able to get any information regarding what sort of standards, if any, are being followed for the buildings, for the courts across the country. Our expert indicated that we need to make sure two things are followed. One is ample circulation of fresh air into the space, and second, a use of the proper filter, either a HEPA filter or a MERV 13 filter. And these are things that we are demanding and hoping that the agency would come to the table for. 6, so what are some of these serious challenges that we're facing? I've already alluded to some, but I wanted to once again emphasize the lack of transparency that we're seeing, the lack of accountability or effective communication. It's the same that we saw in your questions. It's a constant unknown. It's a constant moving target. So, for example, as I mentioned, initially they told us that phase 1 and phase 2 would not have any master calendars because they want to minimize the number of people coming into court. But before the ink was dry, we started hearing that different courts were already talking about master calendars for phase 1 or phase 2. Now, whether or not one can agree or disagree as to what master calendars versus merits is best for any sort of phase, the issue is one of proper communication and transparency. We're not seeing that. Some of you also asked about advancing merits hearings. Well, that's yet another part that we don't know, we don't understand what's happening because of the failure to bargain with us. What a lot of times what we're seeing is that, okay, if there's a decision made not to have a master calendar, now there is a quote unquote hole in our calendar, and court administrators are told, you need to move up cases, you need to tell the judges to move up cases. Well, again, if there was adequate cooperation, adequate preparation with us, there would be ways to address the issues that we're hearing from you about what happens when you thought your case was scheduled for 6 months from now, and all of a sudden you find out that you have a hearing in 2 weeks. So there's been a lot of inadequate timely notice. If you think we know any more about when a court is going to phase 1, we don't. We find out at the same time that everybody else finds out on Twitter as to when a court goes into phase 1. And surprisingly, a lot of times the supervisory judges don't even know when a court goes into phase 1. We've asked for uniform protocols on access to buildings, nothing. On elevators, waiting areas, about calendars, about effective communication with stakeholders to reduce the number of motions that we're getting, nothing, no collaboration. The only thing we ever hear is that, well, judges have control over their courtroom, and look at the policy memorandum that the director issued. The judge can decide what they're going to do, they can control it. But as we all know, this is not about individual fiefdoms. It's about working together as a community, working together as a nation. I may be able to control my courtroom, but if all my other colleagues are also being told that they need to hold hearings and that everybody's being told that they need to come in at the same time, well, obviously me controlling how many people I put into the courtroom is not going to be effective, and we're all going to suffer as everyone is going to be called into the same building in violation of the social distancing rules and the low density gathering rules. So what should we do now? What are some of the long-term considerations? I think we need to recognize that there is a new paradigm. What the pandemic has done has really made us all stop and think about health and well-being of everyone first, but also remember that access to justice and due process and fairness is a key component of our judicial system. So we need to look to see how can we come up with creative ways to balance these and ensure that cases that need to be heard in person are heard in person, but that when we need to be more creative and think about technological solutions, that we're looking at those technological solutions. Now, I know the agency has been focused and has had a video teleconferencing system for a long time, but we've grappled with, and the agency has grappled with for the past 20 years, in bringing us to the 21st century on every other part that needs to connect to that. Other courts have been much more progressive. Within a short period of time, they've been able to take the platform to the next level and to allow people to be able to come in and be able to connect with us without having to come into the court. We don't have that capacity right now. Our digital audio recording, according to the agency, can't even function on the latest laptops because it's that outdated. Not to mention that we don't even have laptops for everyone. I would end with one example that I think exemplifies the true challenge of what we're seeing. One of the probably better decisions that the agency has made in response to the pandemic, and one that has been in large part supported, has been the recognition that we need to start accepting electronic filings through the email filing. So what is the first thing that the agency has done now with the resumption of the non-detained docket is to say, okay, we're going to stop accepting that within 60 days. So one step forward, two steps back. Now, I can explain to you that a lot of the reasons behind that at first glance is to try to acknowledge the fact that this is a heavy, the way that they've implemented it has been a heavy hit on our support staff. And I can tell you that our support staff has been working diligently and have been in large part risking their lives to come to work. But the answer isn't to just stop the electronic filing. The answer is to come up with ways to work together that would not have the impact on the support staff and would allow us to take it to the next level so that we can look to more creative ways to work together to protect the health of everyone and to make sure that we protect access to due process and fairness while doing so. So this concludes the first part of our presentation. I hope that you have found it to be helpful. I'm going to turn it over to Judge Cole. Judge Cole, I think you may be on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Judge Salvador. So traditionally, EOIR has engaged in stakeholder meetings, usually on a local level and at times on a more broader bench to bar level. And these engagements have in large part been eliminated, which has understandably caused a great chasm between the court and the stakeholders that we have seen, as we have seen more recently. So the next portion of our town hall is intended to bridge some of the gap. So we are going to hear from three different sets of stakeholder representatives. The first is going to be Andrew Nieder, who is both a private immigration attorney in San Diego, California, but is also a member of AILA's Board of Governors. We're also going to hear from several DHS OCC trial attorneys, including Fanny Bahar Ostro. Ms. Bahar Ostro is the president of the AFGE union representing the DHS trial attorneys. Also, Janine Freed is on the board of directors of the trial attorney union. And finally, we're going to hear from Eric Bales, who is a trial attorney in Dallas and is a representative member of the union. After the DHS OCC trial attorneys, we're also going to hear from Stephanie Cordero on behalf of the Legal Aid Society, chapter of the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys from New York City. So first off is Andrew Nieder from AILA San Diego. Mr. Nieder, welcome.
Thank you, Judge Cole.
Mr. Nieder, good evening. I know we talked briefly about this section. I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us and to let everybody know that we are grateful to have a representative from the private bar, and AILA being one of the largest organizations representing the private bar. So Mr. Nieder, we talked about maybe focusing on a couple of areas considering that we do have limited time, but why don't you tell us a little bit about what has been the impact of the pandemic on the private bar?
Certainly, yes. Thank you, Judge Salvador. I really wanted to start by expressing what's probably the main source of anxiety and frustration among immigration practitioners right now. And that's really the lack of information and concerns about transparency regarding the phased reopening. And these are concerns related to actual health and safety. And so I know these are concerns that are shared by the immigration judges and the court staff. So one thing that we're worried about is really how the decisions about reopening are being made. And specifically, are these decisions being made at the local level, or are they more centrally being made by the agency or by the departments? And Judge Salvador, you did touch on this a bit, but just as important is who has a role in modifying these decisions going forward, so related to the opening and closing, to PPE requirements, the real nuts and bolts decisions that give us a practical idea of what to expect. I noticed, Judge Salvador, you mentioned the role of the various U.S. attorneys' offices and the role that they play in these decisions. And so an obvious concern that brings up to me is just thinking about their physical space, their access to the public at the U.S. attorney's office. That's not necessarily the same as what exists in immigration courts, which may or may not be even in the same building. They could be miles away in an office tower or in a detention center. And then in addition to who's making these decisions is a concern about really the dissemination of the information. Because to be frank, there has to be a better way for practitioners and respondents to know about important decisions that are being made other than by checking our Twitter feeds every morning. And for the most part, it's what's happening in the local courts that we care about. So when I walk into immigration court in the waiting room next week, am I going to be walking into a room with 5 people or 50 people? And so I'm interested in having an engagement with ACIJ about how we can better communicate between us, specifically at the individual court level, so that local practitioners get timely information, which is really more important than ever because of COVID-19.
And I think you've highlighted some really key considerations. I can tell you that on our Health and Safety Committee, we have also raised questions about, well, what happens when the numbers go up and there needs to be a reverse, stepping back. And there hasn't been much transparency about that. It's really not clear how that's happening. So we will definitely, I think Judge Chacon has indicated that some of those questions may be more in detail addressed during the Q&A session. But I can definitely tell you that these are issues that we have raised and are pushing as much for transparency and collaboration. Do you have any sort of other or additional sort of recommendations or areas that you would think would be helpful for collaboration on this area or for solutions?
I think some of the most important ways that collaboration can be improved is really through communication, because I understand that maybe the judges aren't getting particularly timely information either, but the immigration attorneys and unrepresented respondents are even 2 steps behind that. So if there's at least some protocol in place where some stakeholder in the community, whether it's somebody from AILA or some other organization or some other bar, that can have a regular contact, that can call somebody and say, hey, we heard that this might be happening at the courts today. Is that true? Can you give us an update on what's happening over the next few days? Some regular protocol where there's a set person, a person of contact within the court, a person of contact within the community, so that the rumor monger doesn't start and we just hear 5 different stories before we figure out eventually what is really happening. And many times by that point, it's too late anyway.
And that's a lot of what we've also been experiencing is that they would say, well, you can talk to the supervisory judge, but the supervisory judge hasn't been told anything. And everybody, and he or she finds out along with everybody else with the Twitter feed, oh, okay, we're now in phase 1. Well, what does phase 1 even mean? And we kept saying, you need to have these local stakeholder meetings as well as to work with us so that we would reduce the confusion and reduce unnecessary filings, unnecessary motions.
And it certainly is disturbing to us to hear that the immigration judges are not getting timely information. But believe it or not, just knowing that you may have as little information as we do today has a certain comfort level, because I think there's this idea that everybody in the court must know what's going on, and we're out here, we have no idea. If we know that at least the minimal information we have is the minimal information that's out there, there's some value to that also. So again, if we can just have the ability to reach out and communicate with somebody, even if we don't get the most responsive answer, just to know that we tried and we at least have the most current information that the court has.
Well, we definitely are hearing you, and as a part of this goal is for everyone to hear each other and to try to come up with some best practices that we can work within our sort of purview. So I see that we're sort of at the end of our session, but with you, Mr. Nieder, thank you so much for your participation. I'm sure we can continue to work with AILA and other stakeholders in the future.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Nieder. So our next speakers are from DHS OCC, Fanny Behar Ostro, Janine Freed, and Eric Bales. Welcome to all of you. Ms. Bejar-Ostro.
Good afternoon. Let me see, Ms. Ostro, you need to unmute yourself, and I think she needed some help with the video. There she is. We see her. We need the three stakeholder representatives to unmute yourself first of all. So I see Ms. Bejar-Ostro unmuted, Ms. Freed unmuted, great, and Mr. Bales. Can I see you unmuted? Perfect. Thank you three for joining us. We're very grateful that we have representatives from the Trial Attorney Union. Ms. Bejar-Ostro, as the president of the AFGE Local 511, you have a good sense of what's happening across the country. Your sort of fingers on the pulse of what the trial attorneys are sort of dealing with, along with, of course, your colleagues who are here. So I think to help everyone, what we thought would be helpful for the three of you to perhaps address is three key components. One is, well, what has been the impact of the pandemic on the trial attorneys? You know, where are you now? What are your current working conditions? Two, what are the challenges that you are experiencing or anticipate as we ramp up with the reopening? And finally, you know, it's a little bit of a best practices. You know, there's a large part of your colleagues across the table who are here who may not quite know what's happening behind the trial attorney sort of curtain. And it would be helpful for them to know how best to come up with some best practices to work together, especially during this time where we need to do a lot more outside the court and we need to have more collaboration. So I turn it over to the three of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Judge Tavador. Hello, everybody. Once again, I'm president of AFGE Local 511. And for those of you who don't know who we are the ICE Professionals Union. I want to say that the thoughts that I and my two colleagues, Janine and Eric, are sharing with you today are our own personal opinions as union representatives and do not represent the views of DHS. So
this meeting is being recorded.
When the threat of this pandemic began and it became a reality, just for a little background, when the threat of this pandemic began and it became a reality for all of us this year, our union felt very, very fortunate that we were able to join forces with NAIJ and AILA to demand that the immigration courts suspend hearings or even more so that they close completely. Our joint efforts were effective to a certain degree, and even though we didn't get the courts to close down completely, EOIR did suspend all the non-detained and MPP dockets, and for the majority of the detained dockets, the courts did grant us the ability to appear remotely by telephone. So as a result of that, the majority of the OPLA attorneys have been able to telework, thus minimizing our exposure to the COVID-19 threat. And I know that all the attorneys are very grateful that they're able to continue working while remaining safe. Now, our main concern right now that we're facing is reopening, which you already spoke to. And ICE has issued a reconstitution plan, and I say that unlike EOIR, ICE has invited our union to participate and collaborate within a labor management working group while they were drafting the reconstitution plan, and we were able to give input. And also before the reconstitution plan was issued in each locality, our stewards have also been given the opportunity to review it and give input. And we are very grateful that we've been able to do that. This plan consists of 3 phases, and it has 6 gating criteria that must be met before any locality can start reopening and implement the phases. And our concern is that EOIR is starting to resume the non-detained dockets and in a way forcing OPLA's hand to implement these phases before we're meeting any of the gating criteria as exhibited in our reconstitution plan. And that is a really big concern. And I know that you've already talked about the lack of transparency. And once again, that's our main question. Like, who's determining when and why a particular locality is reopening? What criteria is EOIR using when making these reopening decisions? And we want to know why there's no transparency, just like you're asking, and why there's no collaboration between EOIR and all the stakeholders in making these determinations. My colleague, Eric and Janine, are both going to speak to you a little bit more about what they have been facing in the field while they're teleworking and handling these hearings remotely, and also some recommendations that they may be making regarding technology to make our jobs a little easier while working during this pandemic. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Fanny. Thank you, Judge Tabador, for having us on here.
Good to see you.
Thank you. So a unique experience. After 8 years as a trial attorney, I was briefly an immigration judge, not quite 1 year, and decided that was not a good fit and came back to the agency. I've been a national officer with the union, but now it's pretty much fair to say I'm of counsel, as much as Fanny would love to draw me back to the executive board. So our experiences, I'll speak to my experience in Dallas, but also what I've gathered from listening to other offices around the country that I'm still in touch with, even though I'm not a national officer any longer. Now, from the union perspective, the agency that we work for was historically less than friendly to the idea of telework. But when COVID came, it really forced everybody's hand. And now there seems to be a much greater acceptance by management at every level of the organization. I obviously can't speak for them, but it seems that we as the line attorneys have proven that we can be efficient, diligent, and accountable. And we will get the mission done, we will get the work done. Now, across Local 511, our members, the ACCs, they're enjoying their telework very much. Their overall job satisfaction has gone up, and the collaboration amongst colleagues has gone up as well. And I would trust and hope that the immigration judges are finding the ACCs every bit as attentive and punctual through their telework as they were in person. Now, back towards the end of March, perhaps it phased in differently at different offices, but across the board, OPLA put their trial attorneys on maximum telework, as we call it. And I personally have been teleworking since the middle of March, still working, still doing my hearings, still filling in as duty attorney, etc., remotely from home. Now, what's interesting is that we've learned that some judges around the country do actually still allow in-person appearances at court if you're wearing the appropriate personal protection equipment, etc. That's more the exception than the rule. There are other judges that absolutely will not allow you to appear in person, and if you try, they will turn you away. What's interesting is that disparity sometimes is occurring in the same court, in the same city. So when it's true in court 1, it's not necessarily true in court 3. Now, we've probably all experienced that. Generally, it's just preferences of judges, but that's been a little difficult to manage, I think, more for our private bar counterparts than ourselves. For us, our practice is we don't go to the court. We don't even go to the field office, absent a true need and with advanced consultation and permissions. As to the conducting of the hearings without VTC, that has been interesting because I can't see what the other person's doing. All I can do is hear, and sometimes not all that well. Now, my experience and most of my colleagues' experiences indicate that the connectivity is very good and reliable during most of their individual hearings. That's not always the case on the master calendar hearings. Some are better than others. And what I've noticed from my personal experience is that with this conference call system that EOIR has been using, especially when we start getting into some of the remote areas, I won't name specifically where though, it's perhaps technological limitations of that system, perhaps it's bandwidth by the telecommunications providers, I'm not sure, but some of the audio does break down for us. I want to say I'm very impressed with all the judges I work with who've been incredibly patient, more patient than I have been, when we try to overcome and work through those complications. Now, some ACCs like myself, they work from home, that are working from home have only cellular phones. There are no landlines in my house. There haven't been for almost a decade. But that doesn't always work for where we're at. Some of those attorneys have done the workarounds, and perhaps for private bar colleagues who have the same experience, they've gone ahead and gone to their cable providers and gotten VoIP lines, voice over internet protocol phone lines. So they
And I do see, I hate to say it, we are sort of, closing in on the session for the DHS part. So I would ask that you sort of, absolutely, we can follow up some more, but just maybe some quick closing remarks, and I can have Ms. Freed also.
Absolutely, I apologize. One of the other challenges we're seeing is the filing of documents in Dallas and other places. They are doing the email part for individual hearings. That tends to work out for master calendars. That's been problematic at best, especially working with Fort Worth Adjudication Center and the Falls Church Adjudication Center, since they have to be filed at the original court. They don't always get where they're going. So it's been hit and miss. I know Ms. Freed will talk more about the ECUS or ECASE system. And then, of course, obviously with the difficulties we have not being live, those Perry Mason moments are a thing of the past for impeachment and rebuttal evidence. Some courts are actually refusing to allow that to even be introduced. So those are some of the challenges that we've seen for both sides.
Those are definitely some things to consider. And this is the first step of the conversation with everyone. So thank you so much, Mr. Bales. Always good to see you. And Ms. Freed, nice to meet you.
Yes, thank you, Judge Tabador. I would just like to quickly run through some recommendations that trial attorneys would find very helpful, and I'm sure the private bar would as well. It's very comforting to know that we're really all in the same boat. We care about safety foremost, and we care about due process. So firstly, a single standing court order permitting telephonic appearances would be very critical to our mission at this point. Rather than having a quilt work of multiple orders from multiple judges within a single court permitting telephonic, and at a minimum, we would urge every immigration judge to approve telephonic appearances. It's a safety matter. Everyone has different levels of medical issues, whatnot. So please do approve telephonic appearances. Please permit us to direct our limited resources on substantive issues in our case, as opposed to filing and having the administrative burden of filing these telephonic motions for appearance. We are making court virtual now. Please, let's leverage technology. Of course, we need a more official conduit than Twitter at midnight or 1 a.m. To know whether the court is open or not, what's happening the next day. The court has all of our contact information, so it really should seem like an easy task to be able to directly contact people. Move away, please, from the telephone conference line only, and please leverage technology, much like Zoom that we have here now. There are many platforms that EOIR can leverage in order to better facilitate courtroom procedures. EOIR would also have more control over the quality of the proceeding, and also would be more efficient to just get the parties all together more quickly. Also, we urge a broader rollout of the electronic case filing system. EOIR piloted their ECASE system quite some time ago. So the technology is there. Apparently they purchased the software. All the parties in the same room need to know what the record of proceedings is. It's critical. When I'm in court, I'm handling a detained docket. Very often, there's even been a briefing schedule, and the judge, who it's apparent has been probably told that they're appearing on the bench moments before, perhaps, the court proceeding. We don't even know whether the judge has all the submissions, whether all the evidence was received. I would say there was one docket I covered where 90% of the filings never made it to the judge. So if you had a uniform system where everybody could just file, the federal court system has had e-filing for at least 3 decades now. So really, I would hope that all the stakeholders have a unified voice and come together and really push EOIR to leverage technology in order to make this whole process run more smoothly, because from the trial attorney's perspective, this is not a momentary issue. COVID, unfortunately, is a situation that we will have to bear with for maybe 1, 2, or more years. So thank you for listening to our concerns, and I hope that we can work together to make this better.
Well, obviously you've done your homework and you've come in with, everything you can think of. So that's good. This is the first step. I see that there's some potentials for us there's some obviously overlap. Others we may agree to disagree, but that's okay. And that's exactly what a court is supposed to do with the stakeholders. So thank you so much. Our last, but not least, sort of stakeholder representative tonight is Ms. Stephanie Cordero. Do we have Ms. Stephanie Cordero? There you are, Ms. Cordero. Thank you so much for joining us. I think we briefly also talked in advance of of our meeting tonight, and you're here, as a great representative of people, of the NGO pro bono organizations that have had to deal with the pandemic and the court's response to it. In the next few minutes, maybe I can ask if you can kindly tell us what has been the impact, or what special impact, if any, has the NGO pro bono community have had to deal with the pandemic?
Yes, absolutely. So just for everyone who doesn't know me, that's right, I'm Stephanie Cordero. I'm a staff attorney in the Immigration Unit of the Legal Aid Society of New York City. I also serve as a civil alternate vice president of the Legal Aid Society's chapter of our union, the UAW 2325 Association for Legal Aid Attorneys. And then first I want to start by thanking the NAIJ for getting us together here. I think that because of our jobs, we're often representing different interests, but if there's anything good that can come out of this crisis, is that we can come together to protect the lives of our loved ones, of our families, and of our clients and ourselves. And so just to give an overview of how this has impacted us, the nonprofit sector, we were forced at the beginning of the pandemic when New York City, the UIR, the OCA, which is the Office for Court Administration that administers the courts in New York, they were late in closing the courthouses. And as a result, we were forced to go in unhealthy, in very risky situations. Many of our members did get sick with the virus. We had at least one member, unfortunately, from Legal Aid Society pass away from COVID, and it was precisely because the court, in this case the OCA, state court had it closed, and he was exposed and was immunocompromised. And so it's hit us hard. And in addition, we've had the challenge of dealing with our clients who, through this pandemic, on top of being, from the underrepresented populations that they come, suffering from poverty, this hit them even harder. And it's been tough having to prepare them for cases on top of their worries about rent, about work, about their own health. Many of our clients live in the areas that were hit by the pandemic here in New York City. And it's been really tough trying to prepare them for hearings that don't happen, that we don't get notice that they will get canceled. We've had to struggle with ethical issues about how we're representing our clients in court, whether we're doing enough, and facing the prospect of having to go forward on cases that we don't feel are adequately prepared because we don't have the conditions for that. Some actions we've taken at Legal Aid have been to hire our own health expert. This is a public health crisis. We also want to provide evidence-based suggestions for reopening, and we've hired, Legal Aid has hired its own expert to tour the spaces, not just the UIR and UCIS, but also OCA, state courts, in order to assess whether it's safe for us, for the staff to go back in, and for our clients. We have been met with some, there were some cooperation initially by OCA. It seemed like we were going to work together to come up with plans for reopening that are safe for everyone. But it seems like we've lost that a little bit, and now OCA has been pulling out plans to reopen as of this past Monday, and then additional courts next week. And as to EOIR and USAS, we haven't heard from them about whether they would want to cooperate with us and allow our expert to visit the spaces. Legal Aid brought a lawsuit against OCA for premature opening of the criminal courts. And in the meantime, we're just trying to get our own expert to go into the spaces that we practice in immigration court, and we've had the expert also go to the jails. As a union, we have taken the position that no staff, no member will go into a space that has not been deemed safe by the expert, and as long as and if there's not a vote by the union. And so far, we're on the same page with Legal Aid. They've been supporting the same position. I think some of the recommendations that I would have, as a union is, and maybe a question as well, is to see if you've also taking a stance, as our union has, to tell EOIR that your judges won't be returning until it is deemed safe, until there's evidence that that you're safe, or until there is a vaccine. And I heard before you were saying you're ready to take all the legal remedies, but I do think that it will be powerful to be public about a position that I think I'm hearing from you, but it will be powerful to have it made public if possible. I think some of us from the union have considered or thought about litigation against the OIR or USCIS. I think we're in a tough position in terms of standing, but I do think the NAIJ is in a very special position as employees of the OIR, and you may have contractual claims, OSHA type claims, and other claims that we might not benefit from. And so I would really encourage, and you've obviously said that you're seeking those legal remedies, but definitely to make use of those, because we are not necessarily in that position that you are, and we would of course support that in any way that we could.
I'd really appreciate what you were saying in terms of what I sense is this, and that's something we've heard, there's this deep sense of distrust. There's this deep sense of, I want to feel safe going into this space. And when you're calling for an independent inspection, it's because you don't trust the source. And it's because the source is not working with you, is not transparent with you, is not sharing with you the information that they're using. Oftentimes, if they share it with you, things can work. You can work in collaboration. But a lot of what we've seen is what is an already a tough situation, especially when you've been in the epicenter like you all have, and have lost someone to this, someone close. It is a very, very tremendous emotional trauma you have to deal with. So we definitely hear you, and that's one of the things that we've been trying to work with is to work with, come up with a collaborative way. We were hoping more with the agency so that there would be this trust and there would be this communication. I do see we are past our time. This is only the beginning, everyone. You've only heard some of the initial recommendations, initial sharing, and this is just to sort of be a preview of how we can and share in our experiences, share in our recommendations, and look to see how we can collaborate. So thank you so much, Ms. Cordero. We are at the conclusion of the second part of tonight's stakeholder meeting, and I'm going to turn it over to Judge Cole to introduce the third part.
Yes, don't go away yet. We're not done. So as we transition to our last segment, we're going to be answering some very specific questions that have been asked by stakeholders, both during the registration for this stakeholder town hall and also during the town hall. So for this, we are going to turn to Judge Amina Khan. Judge Khan is the Executive Vice President of NAIJ and has been an immigration judge since December of 2010. And she presides over a non-detained docket in New York City. Judge Khan.
Thank you, Judge Cole, and good evening to everyone. I would like to thank everyone for forwarding their questions, which will be answered by our NAIJ board members. This evening's attendance and numerous thoughtful questions submitted exemplify our concerted concerns. In our desire to be responsive to everyone, we will be asking representational questions. Additionally, as noted earlier by Judge Cole, we'll be accepting questions during tonight's meeting. We have to collectively strive to work within the system we now have to improve the system and ensure that the safety, health, and well-being of all participants and the greater community is protected while proceedings are convened during the pandemic. Our first question is for Judge Dana Marks, who is currently seated at the San Francisco Immigration Court. Judge Marks is our President Emeritus of NAIJ. Judge Marks, we received many questions concerning notice, procedures for notifying counsel of change of court dates, including advancing court dates, many practitioners have asked if they could receive more notice of postponed hearings to assist in considering or considered use of their available resources. Judge Mark, could you address this issue?
Yes, and it was over 30 years ago, but I did have a background in private practice. So I totally understand how difficult it is for an attorney to have to turn on a dime. You've heard the theme. We don't have control over those decisions. In terms of trying to give more notice as to when a court is open, we have repeatedly asked that of EOIR. They have insisted that 14 days notice is sufficient. And the mechanics of which cases will go forward is mysterious to many of us judges as well, because that's something that is decided by the local ACIJ in conjunction with the court administrator. We are pretty much told to show up and do the work that's assigned to us. They do not allow us to necessarily own our cases. It could be a different judge. It could be a different time frame. And although we've made many creative suggestions, like how about cancellation of removal cases where people have an incentive to move those quickly? Why don't you put those on? We have not had any buy-in from EOIR on that point.
Thank you, Judge Marks. And a little more specifically, one of our questioners asked that during this time period, given the COVID-19 crisis, what are your thoughts with regard to EOIR issuing guidance to allow for some sort of status conference before the 2-week document deadlines to get the same parties on the same page about whether the hearings will go forward and when the documents are due?
When someone asks us to get nationwide guidance, that's always a very dicey issue because, and I think you'll understand, the judges want to have some control over the docket and how the case advances. And so having a nationwide requirement is problematic for us in terms of decisional independence and not wanting to cede that to EOIR. We try to talk to our various members and try to achieve a more uniform response when we can to certain problems. The idea of having a status conference before a filing deadline is a difficult one in a short turnaround time for the cases that are put on the docket. It's a difficult one in some of our local areas where the government attorneys are not as cooperative or as able to narrow legal issues. And I know in San Francisco, we joke that stipulation is a 4-letter word, and it's different in other places in the country. So it makes it difficult for us to try to make things uniform, but we're listening. The judges are listening, and we're trying our best to accommodate those kinds of needs. I'd say put it in a motion, explain why it may be difficult for you to only on 2 weeks' notice appear, and at least have that in the record.
Thank you very much, Judge Marks. We've also received numerous questions regarding health and safety concerns. Judge Mimi Sankov, who is our NAIJ Eastern Region Vice President and Grievance Co-Chair, and who is currently seated at the New York Immigration Court at 26 Federal Plaza, will address some of these questions. Judge Sankov, what protocols has EOIR asked for GSA to implement to ensure health and safety of all who must physically appear in court? And can you also address any PPE requirements that have been put in place by EOIR?
Thank you, Judge Kahn. So I guess I'd first start by saying we absolutely endorse the use of personal protective equipment, PPE. And the agency has pronounced some broad requirements of social distancing, mask wearing. They've even provided some masks, up to 2 a day for the judges. And the agency has also instituted some courthouse cleaning protocols. They've also provided some contact notifications for COVID positive individuals. But you know, the devil is really in the details, and we don't have those details, as you've been hearing all night. There's a lack of transparency, and that leaves not only the NAIJ, but the judges, all of the judges, very concerned. They're worrying not only about their health and safety, but the safety of all of the stakeholders. So in terms of the range of concerns that we have, we're really worried about building access, safety, hallway safety, courtroom safety. And on the other hand, we also are worried about how these layers of protection might impact access to the court for the parties. So we have been engaged in a steady drumbeat of questions to the agency about why specific courts have opened and then shut down. And we've been forwarding specific recommendations to the agency about what we expect from them in terms of safety. Unfortunately, as you're hearing, we are quite powerless in terms of our ability to demand practices and procedures. The agency is required to hold a joint health and safety committee, which NAIJ understands really to be a forum for discussion and a free exchange of ideas to advance all joint goals for safety, but we have hit some roadblocks in this process. And presently, our recommendations are really just under review by the agency. Some of you have suggested staggering master calendar hearings, and we're supportive of that. The judges are told to enforce social distancing in their courtrooms on their own. So we see that as quite challenging in the courtroom, given the number of responsibilities immigration judges already have, and since they don't have bailiffs or any staff assisting them in the courtroom oftentimes. These are the types of concerns about which we have raised our worries with the agency, and we welcome and continue to welcome your recommendations. As for ensuring social distancing in the hallways and waiting areas, as some of you have asked, the local ACIJs and court administrators seem to be responsible for ensuring safety protocols, but without additional staff to enforce those protocols in the hallways, et cetera, it's going to be hard to see how this is going to be ensured. So we are going to continue to press on this issue because it's very serious and of concern to us. As for the reopening decisions, we do understand that these decisions about reopening are being made by the U.S. Attorney, as you've heard, in coordination with the Department of Justice, Justice Management Division, and possibly with EOIR. The level of communication and range of discussion, we don't know. We also don't have that granular data about what they're considering, what they're specifically looking at, as Judge Tapnor mentioned previously. As for the litigants who test positive, this was another question that was raised by those in the audience. It all appears to be up to the judges, individual judges, to somehow sort through a motions process in individual cases, how to address when someone has tested positive. But that also doesn't address situations involving individuals who fail to notify the court until they've already appeared. So we've raised this safety concern as well. Finally, I would just note that in the courtrooms, we've raised concerns about air circulation, which is one of the things that you've heard mentioned, and one of our writers here has raised a question about it. The provision of HEPA filters and other types of filters are safety considerations that we are following very closely. We are only informed at this time that they are being addressed, so we can't offer more detail. But we have recommended through the Joint Safety Committee that the agency be very mindful about everyone's safety, and frankly put us all at a level of peace of mind, because we need to know if there's been a COVID exposure so that we can all take precautions that we find to be appropriate and that are mandated within our communities. One protection being afforded that you may not be aware of is the use of dual courtrooms for hearings, where some parties are located in a nearby courtroom and they use VTC within the same courthouse to participate in a hearing that's happening down the hall, down the corridor. We hope that this offers some type of protection, and we do appreciate the creativity on the part of the agency in coming up with this solution. But of course, without air quality data, there is no way of knowing if that's going to be sufficient. Judge Khan?
Thank you very much, Judge Sankov. We also received many questions about master calendar hearings during this time period. Some of the questions will be addressed by Judge Donna O'Hare, who is our NAIJ Western Region Vice President and also Grievance Co-Chair. Judge O'Hare is seated at the Denver Immigration Court. Judge O'Hare, for master calendar hearings, can an attorney appear telephonically at the hearing and have the respondent's presence been waived due to the current risk of spreading the coronavirus?
Well, Judge Khan, the short answer is absolutely. And the question is how it's going to be done. And I think all of us on the NAIJ side, and probably all of our colleagues within the immigration judge ranks, want to limit the number of people in the courtroom as best we can. Now, the starting point is the agency has told us that there will not be master calendar hearings as we've traditionally known them until what they consider to be phase 3 of the reopening criteria being met. And so far, we understand that only Buffalo nationwide has advanced to that stage. But that doesn't mean that, I guess they hold open the possibility there'll be some manner of master calendars, not the 50-case huge dockets that we're used to with crowding in the hallways, multiple master calendars going on at once, but perhaps something smaller. And what we are looking to do, I think all of my colleagues are interested in trying to find a way to limit the number of personal in-court appearances to make sure that we achieve that kind of social distancing. Now, the ways that is being done are a little bit different in different places. Most of the courts have standing orders in place now. Some of them explicitly waive appearances of attorneys and even respondents at master calendars, or at least that's what some of the proposed standing orders that have to be approved by agency management would include. And we have one in Denver that is currently under review that I think would do exactly that. Short of the standing order allowing that to happen for each and every master calendar case, you can always ask for that in an individual case. And typically, that's, again, will weigh the interest in as individual judges and in minimizing the number of people in the courtroom. And so if you move according to the Immigration Court Practice Manual and any applicable standing order to waive the appearance of an attorney or of the respondent, him or herself, likewise, the Department of Homeland Security moving to waive its appearance. Those will all be considered on a case-by-case basis unless and until there is a standing order that would allow that.
Thank you, Judge O'Hare. Additionally, many have asked, why not eliminate the need for master calendar hearings by allowing the filing of written pleadings and applications for relief? Additionally, perhaps some of the individual hearings could be determined on the papers when there is non-opposition from DHS and a well-documented case.
Also a very good question. And again, I can't speak other than to my own experience. But what I've seen is I've been on telework now since late March, and I have had some things that I've been able to complete simply on the paper. Someone, for example, wants voluntary departure, has a consular interview scheduled, and there's no opposition from the other side. We can grant that. We can do that all on the paper, provided everything's in place. Other master calendars, again, some of this may be incorporated in standing orders for certain courts, would allow people simply to proceed by pleadings. In other words, if there's not going to be the type of thing you need to hash out issues in person on, many cases you see there's no contest to removability. Someone believes they have a strong application for relief, simply wants it set for a hearing. And in that case, my job as the immigration judge is easy. It's just to set deadlines and to say, well, let's have applications filed by this date. Let's have all supporting information by that date, and we'll come back for a hearing on this date. And so some of that, again, is going to be handled by standing orders that will allow for that kind of volley of pleadings. We've been, on the NAIJ side, NAIJ side, we've been very vigilant about ensuring that our ability to control the proceedings, which is something that's encapsulated into the regulations, is honored by the agency. And so far, we have seen no pushback on that principle. So again, we have our own ability to control the course of proceedings. And I think most of my colleagues have been very vigilant about ensuring that we have that ability to make what we think is a wise decision on a particular case situation. And so all I can say with that is ask. And sometimes you'll find that things aren't opposed. And if there's no substantial issue that needs to be hashed out at a master calendar, there may not be any need for a physical master calendar. That's the new reality, because it's unlikely that in the very short run or even the medium run that we'll be able to return maybe we don't even want to return to the ordinary model of having 50 people a day coming through court. Again, a lot of these things work well with represented respondents. They don't maybe work so well with unrepresented respondents because we have to talk to them in person. And so with that in mind, we're talking here to an attorney audience. Attorneys should feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, Judge O'Hare. All right. Additionally, we've had numerous questions and suggestions with regard to remote hearings during the pandemic. Many stakeholders want to know why we are not conducting hearings remotely. Judge Dorothy Harbeck, who is the NAIJ Treasurer and Secretary and who is currently seated at the New York Immigration Court at 26 Federal Plaza, will assist us in answering these questions. Judge Harbeck, why are immigration courts not currently holding Zoom master calendar hearings, preliminary hearings, or simple individual hearings remotely to keep people safe?
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with the uniformity of the platforms. Echoing what Judge Marks said about how each immigration judge likes to conduct his or her own calendar, specifically, and doesn't want to be on a cookie cutter assembly line of doing things. It's the converse for the recordings of the hearings. The way that we record hearings, the way that we keep the hearings, the records of the hearings and the proceedings for appeal purposes has to be uniform. The DOJ has determined that Zoom was not secure enough, that there were ways to hack it. Prior to the pandemic, EOIR had been involved with rolling out slowly an ECAS system, which was electronic filing, and there were components of that, I think, that had to do with electronic hearings. And at that point, at the very initial point of the ECAS discussions, the Judges Union had a presence, and then our presence seemed to be minimized, and so we're not really part of that conversation anymore. But of course, I'm aware of Zoom and WebEx and Teams because we've had some of our union meetings through that, and some of our other meetings, but it doesn't seem to work as a system-wide protocol yet, and we can't have some immigration attorneys appearing through Zoom, some appearing through Teams because they've got a better Microsoft system, and some appearing through a Google platform because they have Google but they don't have Microsoft, and it's got to be uniform. A frustrating thing from our point of view, from the judge's point of view, is that the agency hasn't given us clear guidance about it, because it does make sense. It's just that what also makes sense to us is that it has to be uniform throughout. It has to be accessible as an appeal process, and it also has to be available for those who are not represented. For people that have lawyers and they can go into the lawyer's office and they can pull up Zoom or they can pull up WebEx or something and conduct the hearing, that's one thing. But what about the pro ses? It can't be different. And so when EOIR has to create something and has to create a video presence to, allow the hearings to go forth in a uniform fashion, it can't be judge by judge like a scheduling order can be. It's got to be uniform across, and we don't have that yet, and we have to we do have to defer to the mothership, to DOJ, and follow what they have determined to be safe, secure, and uniform as part of the process.
That's right.
And it does seem to be
Judge
frustrating.
Harbeck, that's right. But what we are hopeful. We recognize that we will and are entering into a new paradigm. And so remote hearings will be considered. NAIJ is working strongly. We recognize that other state courts and other federal courts are employing remote hearings. And as Judge Harbeck noted, this is something that we are seeking guidance from our agency. We are recognizing this. Thank you very much, Judge Harbeck. I think what we would also like to hear is with regard to MPP. Many of our stakeholders have asked us numerous inquiries about the MPP docket. Judge Ashley Tabador, our NAIJ president, will address this question. And as you all know, Judge Tabador is seated at the Van Nuys Immigration Court in California. Judge Tabador, how does NAIJ balance the call to keep MPP courts closed due to the pandemic with the fact that this means that many asylum seekers will remain essentially detained indefinitely, possibly as well in dangerous conditions in Mexico with no guarantee of a future hearing date? Judge Tabador?
Thank you, Judge Khan. I know we've received a number of questions about the MPP, and it's one of those very, very difficult areas. And it's sort of the elephant in the room. And what we have to say is, it's really not our call. We are here to make sure that we provide access to everybody. We believe everyone needs to have access, but we also understand that there needs to be health consideration for all involved. What is interesting, and I thought might be of interest to everyone to know, is the agency position regarding MPP. MPP was, anytime we've raised the questions about it, about the decisions to have it, about the decisions about the number of people, about how it's being handled, we have always been told this is a DHS baby, that the agency, DOJ, is just following DHS's lead on that, it's lock and step with DHS, whatever DHS says, DOJ will do on this. We don't really know who's sort of leading the charge on that. But what is interesting was at the beginning, this was steadfast categorized for our judges as a non-detained docket. So we were told this is non-detained, we're going to deal with this as like any other non-detained docket. Judges are just handed those cases and they handle it as they see fit. And then at some point, and it's not quite clear at what point, all of a sudden we started hearing that, oh no, now it's called a detained docket. This is now a detained docket. It's supposed to be handled on a detained docket. It was extreme micromanagement, and an unbelievable number of cases were being assigned to judges. And sort of these dockets were created that were just ballooning up and exploding at the seams. And what has been interesting again is that in response to the pandemic, when we asked the agency about the MPP docket, and we, at the beginning we said, well, you said you're going to suspend all the non-detained cases, but so the MPP is going forward, right? It's the detained docket. They said, well, it's the detained docket, all detained goes forward. And that was at the beginning. And as you've noticed, the announcements on MPP cases have been different. So we haven't seen any sort of consistency on the agency positions regarding the MPP docket. Our position is that our door is open to all cases. We need to make sure, obviously, a minimum standard of health is protected for everyone, but we are here to hear the cases consistent with the conditions.
Thank you very much, Judge Tabador. I'm going to turn this back over to Judge Cole and to yourself, because I see that we are coming down to the end of our meeting time. Thank you. Judge Cole, Judge Tabador.
Thank you. Judge Cole, you're on mute. I don't.
Thank you, Judge Khan. Yeah, we're just about done with today's town hall meeting, and thank you everyone for the questions. And I know there are many, many questions that people had that we weren't able to get to, and hopefully we might be able to have another town hall meeting in the future. But before we finish, a couple of closing thoughts with Judge Tabador.
So just as you saw, what we did today is the first time that we're doing this, and the goal is to try to continue and build upon this. But let me close by saying that it's been a great honor to be a part of the National Association of Immigration Judges. The last few years have certainly been one of the most challenging times that we have ever faced as judges and as an association. But it's also been exciting times because, if nothing else, it has clearly demonstrated that you cannot have a court in a law enforcement agency or judges who are hired and fired by the nation's chief prosecutor and still expected to be run as a traditional court. While other courts in the nation have responded to the pandemic by working closer with their stakeholders in protecting the health and safety of all in providing access to the courts, the immigration courts have pulled the curtain even tighter and darker over agency decision-making and actions. I hope you will consider supporting not just the NAIJ, but the grassroots movement of prominent organizations like the American Bar Association, AILA, and the Federal Bar Association, and others who have stood up for an independent immigration code. And we hope that you have found our session tonight helpful. You will be receiving a survey shortly, seeking your feedback and suggestions from the meeting. We really do hope that this is the first of many and that we can work and build upon this. So I urge you to fill out the survey, and I wish you and your loved ones a good night. Be safe. Thanks again.